Hello, I'm Joan. I'm a Canadian family physician who also works as a restorative medical educator, facilitator, and coach. I create spaces that rehumanize the work of healthcare. I'm creating this podcast to remind myself, as well as anyone else working in a helping profession, that when you are working and caring for your human patients, you are the other human in the room.
That's fine.
Hello there, healthcare humans. Thank you so much for coming back for another episode of The Other Human in the Room. I am super excited to have a wonderful conversation with a fellow healthcare human. I've had the pleasure of meeting you, Dawn, only virtually so far, but I look forward to further conversations someday in person. It'll be fun. And I know that we have a ton in common, excited about being in the healthcare space and supporting ourselves and our fellow healthcare humans to find our way back to ourselves with everything going on. So, with that, I would love if you could introduce yourself to everyone.
Sure. Hi. Hi, listeners to Joan's podcast. My name is Dawn. I'm an emergency doctor and I work at the University Health Network. I'm also a mother of two kids. I'm married to a cardiologist and I'm very interested in storytelling. So I've really sort of um, explored writing and photography during my training, and I'm now a life coach, and I help fellow mother doctors who are struggling with burnout get that life that they really want. So that's me in a
Mm,
nutshell.
love it.
That's how we met.
That's how we met. I'd love to hear a bit more if you don't mind telling. I'm sure you could tell a long, short, or medium-sized story of your journey,
Mhm.
but in particular, um, yeah, what has it been like being a human in healthcare for you over these past number of years, and any insights you've learned along the way?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've noticed is when we go into medicine, we're so young when we make that decision, right?
Yes.
And I think even if you, I think about this a lot, especially when I speak to medical students, even if you have a parent or a role model who's in medicine, it's not the same thing as knowing what it's like when you're in medicine.
Mm,
So to make that decision when you're a teenager or in your early 20s, when you don't really know yourself, it's really hard to know what you're getting into.
mm,
And then once you're in medicine, there are all these expectations of like what it means to be a successful doctor. And I remember I just accepted it. I remember thinking, okay, so teaching, clinical practice, administration, research. That's the formula. That's how you become successful. And I remember always feeling kind of like an outlier. I don't know if
mm.
you ever felt that, Joan,
Oh,
but
yes, very much. Yeah.
like for instance, when we were doing resident projects, people were talking about uh, hypertension protocols or hallway medicine, and I was very interested in aerospace medicine as a trainee, which no one could just no one knew how to advise me. So I was just used to being that person who was just doing her own thing. And then so when I became staff and I started to feel unhappy with what I was doing, and I was doing all the right things, right? I was working a lot, I was teaching a lot. I was trying to do research, but I'm just not a natural
Mm,
researcher and it just didn't feel right for me. So, when I was burnt out in 2012, I decided to just explore different avenues. And that's where I started to think about, okay, what was the person that I was like before medicine? Like, what were
mm.
the things that I loved to do then? And so, I mean, long story short, that's how I got into photography and writing again, because those are things that I enjoyed when I was a teenager and in my 20s. And it was just a very natural exploration. And it just went from there.
Mm. And so, what did that look like when you were re-exploring things that you loved before? Were you doing them sort of in between shifts and your after hours? And was there a point where you started to want to integrate them into your work?
Yeah, oh, for sure. Like, because I'm like most trainees, I traveled a lot.
Mm,
And like you have pictures and you just look that wasn't how I remembered it. So you
mm,
would have this picture and it just looked really flat. And so I thought it would be really fun just to learn how to use my camera properly because I had a quite a nice camera. I just didn't know how to use it properly. It didn't look like anything from magazine, for instance, right? So I just happened to come across the Michael Chang School. They have a digital photography stream,
Mm.
and it was very close to where I live. So I said, oh, you know what? I'll just try taking some night classes. Why not, right? And I think most medical people are quite goal oriented. So in the
Yeah.
back of my mind, I thought, well, I'll get a certificate because that's what we do, right? When we're stressed. When I'm stressed, I learn. So I said, okay, well,
Mm.
I'll learn how to take photography. And I distinctly remember feeling so stressed from, the the complaints and sort of like the general like busyness of the emergency department. And then I would take night classes. And then people in the night class were just from all different backgrounds. A lot of them were adult learners. And we would talk about things like paper quality and inks, right? And composition and like f-stops. And I had no idea what these things were. I'm like, what's an f-stop? I'm like, I had no idea. Like I had no idea how to use my camera. And I had such a great photography teacher named Henry he gave us this assignment. He said, "Your assignment is to take 1,000 photos, make 1,000 photographs, and that's your end goal." And I remember just thinking that I saw the world differently when I was using my camera.
Mm.
And so that was just something that I did purely for the enjoyment, and my headaches would go away at nighttime. Like it
Oh.
would just be so enjoyable to spend those 3 hours speaking to artists and not worrying about people dying or, the crowded hallways. And that's where it started. And I remember talking to a friend of mine, and I said to him, wouldn't it be amazing if I could somehow bring this creativity that I'm starting to put into my life and bring it into medicine somehow? And he said, how? And I said, I have no idea. Like that was just my idea in 2016. I said, I just want to make these two worlds collide. And it wasn't until I took a documentary photography class where I was asked to create a photo essay. But the key was I couldn't have any people in the photo essay. And
Mm.
so I thought, well, maybe the hospital would let me photograph because like there can't be any people, right? So I'm not going
Yeah.
to violate any hospital rules. And so I presented my idea to UHNPR and they were kind of confused at first, but that's how my first photo essay of the emergency department came about. And it just sort of went up from there.
So yeah, what happened next? Was it well received or?
Oh yeah, oh like I had this it's like so funny because I had this idea in my mind that I really wanted to know or like show people what a resuscitation felt like.
Mm.
So when I was with the Christian, who was the PR head at UHM, he was following me around and I was, making photographs of like all sorts of things like, medicine cabinets, beds that were empty, right? Um, I knew that there was a resuscitation that had happened that morning. So I was waiting and I was just, I knew what I would see because, of course, I have done a lot of resuscitations and been part of that team,
Mm.
but it was different photographing it
Mm.
because I think we don't take that pause, right? After, like, it's just so much energy. Like, there's so many people working so hard, and there's this huge frenzy. And then afterwards, you've got to do the paperwork, you've got to break the news to the family members. And like, usually it's like I'm trying to fill out the death certificate, and my hand is still shaking from all the adrenaline,
Yeah.
right? But we don't, I realize that we don't give ourselves that time to just reflect on what happened. So when I photographed, I called it the aftermath. I photographed that, and I think that really touched a chord with fellow healthcare givers because they realized, wow, this is really what it takes. Like this is
Yeah.
the teamwork, and you could see just from what was left over that there were so many things going on. Right,
Mm.
there was a trach table, there was like a chest tube table, there was like machine like ECG rollout on the floor, right? and um and the person's hat was hanging on the
Mm.
bed. So it was one of those things where I think people started to realize that what they did actually mattered.
Mm.
And so yeah, I think that's when I realized that whatever I did, like for me, my personal burnout, my recovery needed that storytelling component, that connection component. And so that's when I realized how important that part, telling stories, sharing, like you and your podcast, how important that is for helping people really talk about things and open up about their experiences.
Yeah. So then I understand you continue to do different photography related to healthcare. And as you were doing that and exploring that and writing more, so you're really accessing and connecting to your creativity and to a sense of self outside of medicine. How did you notice that impacting how you practice medicine?
That's such a great question. What I so I always thought when I became an emergency doctor that I was an adrenaline junkie.
Hmm.
But then I
That's a common
realized
stereotype, isn't it?
it is,
Yeah.
right? But like I'm not a cowboy doctor. There's nothing wrong with that if you are
Mm.
like an adrenaline junkie. But someone said to me, you're not an adrenaline junkie, you're a meaning junkie. And
Mm.
it clicked. I said, oh, that's true. That's actually what I um am craving. And so my burnout was not necessarily the systems gaps that were causing stress. I think that will always be a part of, a system when the resources don't match the demand. But what for me was missing was the human connection. So because
Mm.
everything is so fast, right? So it made sense because, I would just really enjoy suturing a complicated laceration because then I would have 20 minutes to talk to the person in front of me, right? And then, like some people don't like to look at the person next to them in the elevator. I'm the opposite. I'll be like, oh, I like your boots and where did you get that? So when I have a patient that I can talk to, I will, ask them, oh, what book were you reading? Would you recommend it? What do you do? Do you need this hand for work? Oh, you're like a violinist. Like that's so interesting. And then we just have this long conversation. And for me, that's the best part of medicine, the story, right? That aspect. So I realized, so I had thought for a while, maybe I had chosen the wrong specialty because maybe I needed to have a specialty where I could just talk all day long with people. But I think I met that need through the like storytelling with photography and writing.
Mm. Um, so then tell me a bit what happened after that. Like, how had those creative pursuits been able to be woven in with your clinical? Because you've kind of gotten into a place where you're somewhat a formal position as a photographer within your healthcare institution, isn't that right?
Yes, they created a role called photographer in residence, which is just like Dr.
So
Alan
fun.
Peterkin started that with the humanities program at the University of Toronto, which it honestly I think is my proudest line on my
Yeah.
CV.
That's so cool.
Yeah, there's a writer in residence and a dancer in residence. So
Mm.
I think at that time, the university had already started to discover how important it is to integrate the humanities, not just saying it, but really integrating it in the curriculum. And uh, so that was one aspect where I started to get involved. And then so when I was using the photography, initially I was invited to talk about photography and just photography in general for people who are interested in photography. But the slant was to use photography as a tool for advocacy, because really it's just a platform, right? So you could use your podcast as a platform,
Yeah.
social media as a platform, photography and writing. It just happens to be my way of expressing myself. So I was encouraging the students to think about it as their way to tell a story visually and through the written word on whatever topic it was that was interesting to them. And so it was an outlet for them to explore whatever topic that they felt like something that was unjust or something that was really bothering them or, an aspect of medical life that other people just wouldn't really know unless you told that story. So I think until when the pandemic came, and I had proposed photographing the pandemic at UHN, like how it unfolded, that was also another way of sharing that story with the outside world. Because I think, if you remember March 2020, there were still
Mhm.
so many unknowns, right? And it was just, for me, it was like an outlet where instead of following Twitter mindlessly, I could put my mind towards the discipline of, you know, this camera angle, this light, what is this person doing? And
Mm.
it just was just a more healthy way to use my energy
Yeah.
than panicking and really getting sort of sucked into all of the fear and unknown.
Yeah. There's something about being engaged in something where you are actually participating in creating it versus sort of passively consuming it. It's got a very different energy. So I can see, especially during times of uncertainty, I relate to that being so helpful. Um, so then I'd love to hear a bit about how now this new domain of your life is coming into being where you're supporting fellow physicians in a more direct way. So you've been doing these other kinds of work, like you've been teaching and you've been taking care of humans through your clinical practice. You've been doing supporting your fellow clinicians through your art, and now you're doing coaching as well. So how is that coming into the fold, and what does that mean to you?
That was just a very natural progression because I think what I realized was there were a lot of things that I had done to help myself, and it was very piecemeal
Hmm.
in that I wasn't following anyone. Like I didn't have a model, a role model who did what I was doing, and so I would just follow. Remember, I was that outlier. I was
Yep.
always the one. I was talking about, I was asking people in 2012, are you happy with what you're doing? And then people were just like, what else would I do? Right. So
Mm,
it was not something that we spoke about. And then so I just remember I needed to take the space myself, right? Like no one was going to give that to me. I needed to take a time block for myself. No one was going to give that to me. I had to carve that time out. I needed to read books. No one was mentioning what books were. And this is when podcasts weren't even really that popular. Right now, you can, any topic you want, you can read a podcast, get a podcast, listen to a podcast. So it was really piecemeal for me to put together all these things. And then I found that it was difficult when people would ask me, Dawn, you seem happy. Like, what can I do? It was really hard for me to know what the framework was
mm,
to say, okay, this is where you are. Like everyone comes to burnout from a different angle. So I didn't have that framework to say, okay, let's look at it from this point of view. Where are you lacking? Like, where are you feeling empty? And then, um, like, sort of that clarity. I didn't have that way to explain things. So when the pandemic came, I started a support group for, like, a peer group for the people in the emergency department. And it was okay. It was hit and miss. Like people knew that it was there, but
mhm.
it wasn't. I didn't know that that was maybe not the best format to support people. Again, like I just didn't have that framework. So that's when I came across coaching and how it was a systematic way to build that container, right? It's like you know the approach. You know that it's not teaching. Well, you know because you're a coach, right?
Mm,
You know the difference between telling someone this worked for me versus okay, well, like what are you trying to achieve
mm,
and how can like what do you think you need to do and then how can you guide people? So it was a very different skill set and I knew I was completely missing that skill set. So that's why I decided to go for it and become a coach. And it was the best
mm.
decision I ever made.
I love it.
It was really such a great opportunity. Really, it feels like I'm saving lives in a different way. That's how I put it. I don't know if you have that
Mm.
experience as a coach.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like I think it's been a real like pleasure to have a different frame through which I can support and help people. Um, that just feels different than what we offer clinically. It's not even that it's better or worse. It's just nice to have a different frame, and especially for a frame that feels more effective and satisfying for like a fellow clinician, like for a colleague, right? So instead of advice giving, which absolutely has its place if someone is ready to hear advice and have that advice offered, that can be effective. But it's not as often a slam dunk as we'd hope, right? Because we all do live different lives and we've all tried different things. And so there's something about not, from my perspective as the coach, not having to have any of the answers. What a relief for me. What a
Mm-hmm,
pleasure.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And then to offer a space to the person or people I'm supporting for them to be discovering themselves. And it's sort of like what you said, like we come into medicine before we know ourselves. And medicine does not invite us to know ourselves better. Medicine would, like the systems unconsciously would prefer if we all basically thought the same way and preferred the same things. Right. And so there's something a little bit radical and very fun about saying, but remember, you as a human, who are you and how will that actually serve you in your work?
Yeah.
That's one way I think about coaching.
I think it still feels radical, don't
Yeah.
you?
Oh, very much so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so with that, I'd love to hear, you say that you mainly are focusing your support on fellow physician moms. Is that right?
Yes.
So what do you notice are particularly sticky subjects or challenges that you're noticing are common themes that folks are bringing to you um, for coaching?
How long, how long, how long do you have to listen?
Just a couple highlights, whichever ones feel alive for you.
So the reason why I focus on physician mothers is because it's like me coaching the me of 10 years ago, right? So I
Mm,
feel like I'm well positioned to help the person that I once was.
yeah.
So I have a soft spot for these fellow mother doctors. And then so I mean you and I have spoken about Brene Brown's work, and I would definitely say that her work on shame resilience and vulnerability was key to me understanding where I needed to go,
Mm,
because there is that emphasis on not making mistakes in medicine, right? To follow a certain path, right? Certainly in emergency medicine, we want to be fast and not make mistakes, right? So, and
yeah.
you want to make sure that you're pleasing the crowd, the people who are waiting to see you, but you also want to be seen as a collegial doctor to your other colleagues, and you don't want to hand over a lot of unfinished workups, but at the same time, you don't want the consultant to think you're stupid, right? Like
Mm, hmm
there's so many like so many opposing ways that you're being measured. And then you add to that just like the whole medical shame of, you know, when you have a patient complaint or a lawsuit, or if you're not producing enough in the way of publications and getting promoted. So that's one large pool of unvoiced expectations. And then you overlap that with motherhood shame, which I just think we don't talk enough about in medicine. Like for instance, my hospital, we just like fairly recently got a nursing room, a pumping room,
mm,
right? So like what kind of message does that send to our physicians who are young mothers, right?
mm,
Are you going to take a year off and maybe be seen as you're slacking off? Or I'm not saying that's what I'm not saying that's what people were thinking, but these are the messages that people are saying. Can I take a
yeah.
year off? Can I afford to take a year off? Are people going to say that I'm, not a team player if I take a year off? Like, what if I'm trying to be promoted, or I have a leadership position? I have to get back to work. But you also want to be a good mother, right?
Mm,
And so you're hearing all these things that what the lactation consultants say, and you have to breastfeed, or you're a bad mother, or if, like, can I give formula and still be considered a good mother? Am I going to bond with my child? Like, you're hearing all these opposing messages. And so, I mean, I think there's that expectation to not just be good at your work, but to also be a good mother.
yeah.
And so there is that natural comparison competition,
Mm,
right? To pack those nutritious lunches, and to have kids that, aren't smudged with peanut butter and like have their hair up in knots, right? Like no one's gonna judge your partner. They're gonna judge, if your child
hmm
doesn't have their homework done, the teacher's gonna ask, "Wait, like, how come your mother didn't help you?" Right? So, I mean, okay, maybe I'm exaggerating, but all partnerships are different. But certainly, I feel that mothers internalize this
Yeah.
expectation,
Yeah. Absolutely.
yeah, and they're harder on themselves. So when you overlap that medical shame and the tendency towards motherhood shame, it just creates this like very complex feeling where women do not feel necessarily that they have a space for themselves, right? It's like you have so many identities, but what identity is you as a person? What is valuable for you? So I'd have to say that that is a very common struggle with the women that I coach. It's like who am I? Like what's important to me? And
Yeah.
when can I say yes to something that's important to me and not feel that I'm letting down other people by being this version of myself,
Mm.
right? That's huge,
Yeah.
right? And what is coaching really? Like I think of coaching as like a way to get clarity now while you still have time to do something about it, right? So
Mm.
like just imagine the pandemic was a great chance for people to reevaluate what was important to them. You know, you can get that if you have, someone who you love passes away or you get a scary diagnosis or a health scare. Like when a crisis happens, that's a great time to reflect, but coaching gives you that space to reflect now without a crisis necessarily, right? Like
Mm.
you don't necessarily have to be at rock bottom before you start thinking about yourself, but most people don't give themselves that grace to really do that self-reflection.
Mm. I love so much of what you just said and co-sign on everything. I'm curious, how do you personally approach, as well as how do you invite like your clients to approach this struggle, what you just named, where you have a sense of what you want, but you're afraid of letting other people down? So, say I'll ask you for yourself personally. So, say you notice there's something you want, and you're noticing some other part of yourself, or you're noticing there's also a fear there that you might let other people down. What's your personal approach to said dilemmas? Because they can come up minute by minute depending on how many times you think about other people's opinions of you, honestly, right?
Yeah. And where did I hear this? Oh my gosh. Oh, okay. So there's I'm just going to paraphrase.
Yeah.
So I'm going to paraphrase Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. So he basically said the obstacle is the way, right?
Mm.
So where you are having fear, that's where you need to go. That's basically what he's saying,
Mm.
right? So what I think, and I sort of describe this as when you have a very clear path, right? Like the path is laid out for you, okay? We know what medicine wants. We know what people who think mothers should, we know how society wants mothers to be, right?
Hmm.
So there's a clear, very carved, very easy path to follow. So you could just follow it blindly without asking yourself if it's what you want. But you have to add energy, right? Like you have to there's effort, there's
Mm.
energy, there's motivation, there's conviction if you want to veer off of that path. And so that's why it's scary. And I think that it's easier for people to stay in what they know, even if they don't necessarily love the result, right? Because it's so hard and it's so scary. And you're telling yourself, I don't know if, you know, my kids are going to think this is weird or people are going to think that I'm doing something kind of odd if you try something new. But the thing is, where you're having fear, that's where you have to point your attention.
Mm.
And then because that's typically where you're going to start solving things. Because we all know that if you're staying where you are and you're blaming circumstances for what's happening, you're also making a choice. So
Mm.
that's the first step is understanding that where fear is, turn your attention to that. I forgot your question.
Well, it's about if you know you want something,
Oh
but
yeah.
you are afraid of going for it because what you're
Mhm.
afraid of is disappointing other people and letting them down.
Oh, okay, yes. I think I sort of answered that one. But then
Yeah.
I think the second thing that I really if I could just make sure that every mother could have this mindset is that people around you will win when you win first, right? So I
Mm.
think a lot of women or a lot of people who are primary caregivers, right? They think, okay, well, I'm going to do this for other people and that's how I show that I care. But I think the best gift you can give to people who rely on you is to be the strongest version of yourself, right?
Mm.
Because just think about what kind of message do you want to send to your kids? you don't necessarily want to tell your kids that I did something that I didn't care about so that you could be happy,
Mm,
right? You understand that there's a piece for you, there's a piece for me. There's a
mm,
piece for your sibling, there's a piece for your family, but there is a piece for me. And what a lot of people forget when they are trying to do, things for other people is that there's a piece for me comes first. And I don't think that's selfish. I think that that is rejuvenating. I think that that's how you become strong.
mm,
Because if you don't have whatever routine it is for you first, then that's when you're going to be snappy at your kids. That's when you're going to be rude to the patient, right?
mm,
That's when you're saying, no, I don't want to explain the diagnosis to you. Just go, right? Like that's when you won't have that energy. So you have to have that piece for you first, and that comes first.
mm,
And that's how I tell people, you got to win first. Win first, and everyone around you is going to rise.
mm.
And they'll
I
become
love that.
stronger too, right? Because
Yeah.
you don't have to do everything for them.
And that's quite, radical and countercultural to flip the narrative and think that way, isn't it?
I think it is
Yeah.
radical. That way.
And we love that. We love some radical thinking over here for sure. Um, I'd love to return for a little while to the clinical realm, only especially as an emerge doc. So, I'm outpatient family physician. And so I am always thinking like, wow, how do emerge docs do it? Especially like that fear of mistakes. And like you say, though I relate to the tension between going fast and not making mistakes, there's something about other domains of healthcare, including emerge, where uh, your time with a patient is not at all defined other than what you choose to make it. That's actually true even in my domain, but we do have these things called appointments that are in theory time markers, right? So um, I'm curious how you personally, especially using, say, your experience, your creative pursuits, as well as your coaching skills, how your relationship to time versus mistakes has evolved over time. You know, how do you weave that so that you offer the patient what you offer to them? And yeah, like are you aware that there's still time pressures and mistake pressures, or like how does that actually feel for you now at this point in your career?
Yeah, I mean, I think for sure there's always the pressure to go fast. I think the key is understanding two things. The first thing is to understand that the patient needs to know that you deeply care about them and their outcome, right? So
Mm.
when you, like, one thing that I always do, and it's really helpful for me too, just because I'm always on my feet, is I sit down for 2 minutes and I try not to interrupt the patient. The benefit
Mm.
is that I get to sit down, which is just the
That's putting you
best.
first, actually, right? Like
Yeah,
that's
yeah, I
like,
get to
yeah.
sit down and I just listen, and then they have their whole agenda out, right?
Mm.
So before I used to just interrupt because I have a narrative in my mind, right? I need to know
Yeah.
like specifically what's this, right? But when people have 2 minutes to lay it out, one, it doesn't take that much time, and two, they feel heard.
Mm.
So I find that really helps because then you can just hear everything and then you can clarify, okay, what is the real problem? And then I find the rest of the history goes by quite efficiently
Yeah.
with that, right? So one, you get a rest. Two, they feel heard. Three, it's actually counterintuitively fairly efficient just to let them talk. And most people can't talk for more than 2 minutes. I mean, me accepted, and maybe you, but
Depends on the
most
setting,
people
right?
most people can't really just talk uninterrupted for 2 minutes. And then the other thing is to understand like how you want to be paid as a doctor, right?
Mm.
So what do you value? Do you value speed? Some people, it's in their blood to clear the board, and I get that. Like it's viscerally stressful to
Mm.
see the numbers go up, right? Some people are just minimalists in some ways, right? They got to organize, right? And some people need to be paid by the quality of the connection, which is how
Mm.
I like to be paid. Some people, like, there's many ways, right? Some
Yes.
people need to be paid by recognition, whatever. Everybody's different, right? So just understand what it is that you value. There are different criteria and they're always under tension. But I think if you keep that
Yeah.
central, that's very helpful to understand. And you have to understand we have to all understand that even if we do our best, we're going to make mistakes. We're going to miss things. That's just part of medicine.
Mm, yeah. That and just part of being a human, really.
Hmm.
Isn't it funny how? Um, yeah, and there's something about the fear of the shame that comes after you make a mistake. Like speaking of shame, as a fellow Brene Brown fan, um, what does uh how has shame played a role in your journey through burnout? And what do you wish that we all knew about shame that could make our jobs a little bit easier as we work in healthcare?
I think I think for me, the the biggest area where shame affected me was my sleep.
Mm,
Yeah, now that I look, now you're asking such good questions. Sleep for sure.
yeah.
So, and I think the bigger connotation is rest, right? Is this idea
Mm,
of deep rest and play, right? So I think for me, I really valued work and I really valued what my CV looked like.
mm,
And that piece of paper for so long represented that I was worthy,
yep.
right? And then I started to realize, I think, we don't always recognize burnout. Certainly, I was a really slow learner. Like I was just I'm angry because everyone is an idiot.
Yes, it's
I was
everyone
telling
else's fault.
myself, right? It's not me. There's nothing wrong with
No.
me. It's all of you people, right? So I was really slow to pick it up in myself. I would make every single excuse. It was, you know, this is a stupid rule, or people aren't being creative with understanding what success is like, right? Or, REB is unnecessarily complicated. Like I would just make all of these excuses to say why, when I would do something, it just didn't feel valuable to me at the end.
Mm,
So I call those false goals. I don't know if anyone ever coined
ooh,
that first, but it just means like you put so much effort into something,
yes.
and then in the end, it doesn't bring you that joy that you thought it would bring you, right? So why did you do it, right? So I call them false goals. And then so for me, that understanding was, yeah, I needed to take care of myself, and sleep was a big part of that. And I think the biggest shame trigger for me was that I needed to put the patient first. And this may count as another radical topic of conversation,
Hmm.
but I really feel like the sentence of patient, like the slogan, patients come first, is missing a huge part, which is the team of caregivers
Mm,
has to be healthy before the patient can have that great outcome and come first, right? Right? I mean, it's the whole basis
yes.
for your podcast
Yes.
being the other human
Like
in the room, right?
I co-sign very much so. Yeah.
So, right, I think yeah, the need for rest was really big for me. And it was challenged again when I became a mother, because it was, do I need to get up and feed my child, but I'm so exhausted too, right? And like I didn't even have a housekeeper until 6 months into being postpartum, because I thought I'm on holiday, so I can manage the house and I'm not working, so I can cook, I can keep the house clean. I should keep the house clean, and I can take care of my
Mm,
baby because I'm on holiday is basically what I thought.
yeah.
Yeah, so I didn't value rest.
Mm. And so the process of really recognizing the role that like shame messaging played in that, what I'm hearing is that as you slowly learned, and I mean, it makes sense that it's a slow learn because there's
Hmm.
so many messages to the contrary. There's so many messages
Hmm.
that are like, no, no, like the concept of false goals. I just love that. Like all the
Hmm.
false messages. When we follow these sorts of trails, it's not because we're unintelligent. It's because they're sold to us as being the solutions that will finally bring us that worthiness, that validation, that satisfaction. But our body lets us know if they're actually, the emperor with no clothes on. If they're a false goal, like you say, I just think that I just resonate so much with how you just described that. Oh my gosh. Oh,
It's malicious. I actually
no.
I don't think it is because if you think about it, when something works well for you, it's naturally caring for you to say this is what you should do,
This
right?
is
And I
what you
think
could
that's what
do.
a lot of
Mm,
I think that's what a lot of women like to give advice in general, right? To when we're in like a women's group, you're like, oh yeah, 2 kids is perfect, and like you gotta get a housekeeper, right?
yes.
And then like order this meal plan, that's gonna solve everything. Because when it worked well for you, you want to share it with someone who you care about. That's completely natural. And I think that's why mentorship is common in medicine, but not coaching, right?
Mm,
So, I've done this path and I can help you get the same path, right?
yeah.
It is not malicious at all. It is very well intentioned. But the problem is we don't necessarily ask, what is this what you want, right? Like, or
Hmm.
what is it that you want? And then if what you want is not what I did, can I help you? Well, yeah, you can, but it's just you help them in a different way.
Mm.
That makes sense.
No, totally makes sense. I love
Hmm.
that. Well, if you can believe it, we are like at the end of our conversation. I feel like, Dawn, you and this is just one of the first of many conversations because
For sure.
I love finding folks who are within healthcare practicing and breaking the mold in some way. And by the way, that is technically every person because like the mold is nobody. Like we are all actually don't fit the mold one way or another. But I love when people are breaking the mold out loud and supporting others to do the same. Um, so I guess to wrap it up, first thing I'd like to ask is if people love what you're saying, are interested in knowing how they could work with you, where should we direct them?
So you can sign up for my blog. I have a weekly blog.
Mhm.
So I talk about all sorts of things like this. Every Thursday at 8 a.m. I get a new blog post. And my website is called Within Story. So that's WITHINSTORY.com.
Mm.
And then it's just /blog/ if you want to just go straight to the blog.
Mm. Can you tell me a little bit about that domain name? Where did Within Story come from for you?
Yeah, maybe that could be too big. But so that was just the idea that it's within story that we connect with others.
Ugh, yes. That's
Right?
it. Period. That's all you need to say. Oh, wonderful. And then the last thing I invite everyone who comes on to consider is those listening. So we have a variety of listeners. The vast majority work in healthcare, though some don't, which is fun. But vast majority work in healthcare in some capacity. And I think people are drawn to listening if they already have some sense that, yeah, the mold's not quite right. The idea that they should not be human doesn't work for them. They're seeking sources of inspiration and support for how they can feel and protect their humanity within their work. And so, with that in mind, are there any words of encouragement or wisdom that you'd like to offer them?
Mhm. Um, One thing that I would say that I think is just universally beneficial is to focus on your optimal health. So I always say health is your first wealth. So within health, sleep is my number one.
Mm,
And I think when people get back to that just like the very basics of having really good sleep, protecting their sleep, eating well, going for walks with their family, that just gives you some space, right? Like that is not a nice to have, it's a must have.
mm,
Start with that first and then see where that takes you. And the other thing that I wanted to say is a lot of times people are very goal oriented, right? They think, okay, well, I'm going to do this because this will get me that, right? And I think if we let go of that need to have some kind of definite payoff at the end, that
mm,
gives us also the space to follow what interests us. And that's
mm.
where magic happens.
Yes, all about the magic. How much can you experience what you're craving to experience in the future now, actually? Right? Like, often when we're pursuing what we love and interacting with and doing things that we love, we get a little bit of that thing that we were imagining at the end of the rainbow anyway.
Hmm.
And
Something else
or
that's
something else surprising.
completely surprising.
Oh,
Completely
totally.
surprising and better than what you could have imagined, right?
Yeah. Oh, very much so. Well, thank you so much for offering your time and your experience and your stories today, Dawn. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, for those listening, I would invite you to consider what Dawn said, especially about letting go of that goal and any false goals that you're like, does that concept that's just resonating with me? So that's my invitation to those listening. Do you notice that you're chasing after a goal that's you have a sinking suspicion might actually be a false goal? And what would it look like to let that go and be surprised by something else? And with that, we'll talk to you next week. Bye.
Thanks, Joan.
I would love to take this work deeper with you. Visit joanchanmd.com today and discover my growing menu of options for restorative medical education to suit your learning needs. I offer one-on-one coaching, customized workshops, and self-study courses that allow you to connect not only with my work on a deeper level, but also with other healthcare humans just like you. So if you want to start humanizing your work in healthcare to a deeper level and do it in community with others, please visit joanchanmd.com and find those options and what fits you and your life today.